Hello, and welcome back to the movie Remake Time, a Filmmaker's Compass podcast. I'm CP, he's Big Kid D-Man, and we are your hosts. This week, we are going to be talking about two movies that, well, need to be talked about. D-Man, what are we going to be watching this week?
Well, it's funny because one of them is kind of like a B-movie classic, and I'm super excited to talk about it. And the other one is a remake of a B-movie classic. And so we're going to have to address what exactly happened here and why. And today we will be talking about Robocop.
Yes.
So the 1987 classic, as well as the remake that came out a few years ago. And I'm really pumped because Robocop was a movie that when I was a kid, I actually got a chance to watch with my grandma. And
no way.
If you've watched Robocop recently, which it is a movie you should revisit. I actually think the rewatch quality of Robocop, the original, is awesome. It's a lot of fun. And it's a movie that if you watch it with your grandma, you're gonna, especially if you're a kid, you're gonna sit there and be like, I don't know. I didn't know this is how this was gonna go. Like, and no offense, I mean, I know they always kind of get compared, but even to that end, when I'm sitting there with my grandma watching the original RoboCop, I was like, Grandma, I thought it was going to be more like Terminator. And not even like you'd want to watch Terminator with your grandma, but I mean, we'll get into it. But RoboCop was a lot of, it was gory, it was graphic, it was vulgar, and it was a lot of fun. So, first of all, I kind of wanted to get your impressions of why do you think they remade it? What was the purpose here?
Oh man, that's one of those things I scratch my head about all the time. Obviously, you know me. As long as you've known me, you've known that the original RoboCop is one of my favorite movies. I'm not even going to call it a guilty pleasure. It's just an amazing movie in every way, in my opinion. Obviously, they had a really successful franchise. The later RoboCop movies do not hold a flame in any way.
Right. There were two direct sequels and then a television show, yeah?
And I think an animated series.
Yeah.
And I assume it was just the opportunity to capitalize on an incredibly successful franchise that was, making a lot of money.
They did.
In the 80s and the 90s. So I don't know, though. It's weird. Paul Verhoeven actually made a comment when he found out they were remaking it, and he said, I'm under the impression that a remake of RoboCop should not happen until I am dead. And I very much agree with that perspective.
I kind of get it, yeah.
So I guess it's just the money thing, because again, the first RoboCop is obviously this sci-fi movie. It's got a lot of gore. It's got a lot of comedy, but more importantly, it has things to say about America in the 1980s and the world.
Yeah, and crime and all that.
The remake tries to make some of those points, really more about ethics and AI and biotech, but it just doesn't come through in the same way. It's almost a film without a message.
Yep, I was about to say the same thing. I think to the detriment of the new one, it comes across as literally a remake, and it doesn't have anything new to say. And to that end, unless there's a nostalgia factor, which is, I think, what Disney taps into when they do these live action remakes of their animated classics, this nostalgia of kind of getting to see a story and kind of share it with your kids in a new way. Unless you have something new to say here, I don't think there's enough nostalgia for everybody to get super excited about this new RoboCop movie. It just comes across as kind of like, a second grade action film in the 2010s. And it just doesn't hold a candle to the original RoboCop. And I mean, as much as, I would like to leave our listeners hanging on the, the outcome of this discussion, I think we can get it out of the way really quick that the original is in fact the better movie. So, and we're just going to discuss why that is.
Or we'll just end the podcast right now. I guess that's a possibility. Verdict in.
So, okay, let's take a look culturally. When you look at RoboCop and both versions, I mean, what do you think stands out? Because there is, some iconography here that they're playing around with. RoboCop was incredibly recognizable. I mean, for a long time, you could show that and people would be like, RoboCop, probably even in like foreign countries and stuff.
Yeah. Um, Obviously, the design of the RoboCop costume in the
Yeah.
original, um, there's nothing else really like it. It's so kind of buffoonish and cartoonish that you're like, yeah, that's kind of what I would think a robotic man cyborg would look like. And I think that was a really conscious decision, right? Because again, Terminator introduced this concept of kind of the same thing, except
Yeah, right.
Schwarzenegger looks like a regular guy. And in RoboCop, they're like, no, let's make this guy look unique. And I think that that was brilliant because obviously, I think that the love for RoboCop and the reason why this franchise was built was based on that character, you know?
Right. And he, it's funny because like you said, it almost looks a little like cartoonish or buffoonish where, when you watch it, you're like, huh, he's like really thick. Like what's actually going on in there? Is like part of his human body in there? Is it
Yeah.
all just like wires and, like what is it? Hydraulics and all that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that how it's all working? And it's fascinating because he moves, especially in the original one, very robotic.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in the new one, they try to streamline it a little bit, and I get more, I guess, for lack of a better example, I guess more Iron Man vibes. I think he even sounds a little like Iron Man when he moves.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Obviously Iron Man's playing into comics, and especially later, like if you watch the original Iron Man, he moves in a much more metal way. But as it goes on, I mean, Iron Man can basically, move at will. And I got the sense that, especially once they got to the end of the remake, he's very streamlined. Where the original RoboCop has this kind of
slow. You get the feeling that he's like a 2,000-pound man. Yeah.
And there was something so fun about that. It felt like RoboCop.
No, absolutely. And obviously there's a reason why, aside from the cartoons and the series, RoboCop has, he created a whole stream, a whole series of comic books. There was he's made appearance in the Mortal Kombat video games. And of course, I think the biggest testament to his cultural impact is the fact that they are crowdfunding and building a RoboCop statue in Detroit.
That is awesome.
The only other movie character that I can think that happened to is Rocky. So yes, I think that the original had a huge cultural impact.
Now, what do you think in terms of, it's kind of bleak outlook on our future. It's kind of a dystopian future, crime riddled. And this is the case in both movies, but in the 80s one specifically, it's pretty grim. What do you think about that kind of outlook? Because it's interesting that a lot of that obviously hasn't come to pass, but in some ways it kind of has.
Mm-hmm. Obviously at the time, and I know this was before us when this was all happening, this is really a comment on kind of 80s cultures and the classism that was developing. And, there's these wealthy investment, corporate America types, and there's the other people. And aside from that, there's a lot in there sort of about, Reaganomics and what the world is like at this time. And crime was something that was being debated by policymakers and politicians. So I think it's the original is a brilliant commentary on America in 1987.
And that's the thing. That's the difference about the movies is one of them has something to say. Like they're just giving it's not just this kind of like action movie with this kind of like, hey, here's the premise. You're like, no, there's an actual commentary here that you feel like, not that it's going to come to pass, but you're like, you know what, damn it, if this does happen, I hope RoboCop happens.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's take a look then at the effects, because there's a lot to say here. Now, one of the things that I love is the style of the original, but we have to admit that especially when you watch the, what is it?
Ed 229.
Yeah, Ed 209 or whatever it is, in like because I mean, wow, what a scene in a corporate boardroom. They bring in like a drone and it like murders an executive. And then they're like, you know what? And they literally just miss this death. And they're like,
someone's like, oh, get
"Start
an
your
ambulance.
protest."
And you're like, okay, yeah, right.
Yeah.
That's going to do a lot.
But I mean, we have to admit that, I mean, as cool as Ed 209 was, it didn't age particularly well. I mean, it looks dated.
It's really weird because you're right. The Ed 209, which is done in stop motion animation, cool effect at the time, did not hold up at all. There's the scene where Dick gets shot out the window at the end that also is just cringeworthy, considering that pretty much a year later, right, we have Hans Gruber falling from a skyrise, and that looks really good. So again, some of them are not good. I think that the Robocop suit itself still looks pretty good. Looks
fantastic.
There's
what do you
a lot
think about
of
the gore.
That's what I was just going to say. There's a lot of gore effects that I actually think are pretty good.
Dude,
when you watch
brutal.
The murder of
Murphy.
Yeah, that's an intense scene. And I mean, there is that one shot where the mannequin sits up and gets essentially his head blown up.
Yeah.
Which it's more akin to kind of the visual effects of the original Terminator. But for the most part, the violence, the bullets, all that stuff, I still watch and I'm like, wow, that's pretty good. Like that's something to be admired from an action film standpoint.
No, it was pretty crazy. I even rewound it when I was watching the original because like there's one point where like he gets his hand blown off. And I was like, did he just get his hand blown off?
Yeah.
And I was like, oh my God. And then they really shoot him up and then the guy, shoots him in the head. It was pretty intense. And again, imagine, I don't know how old I was, maybe 8, watching that with my grandma. And then like the gang, all those guys, they curse. I mean, it's a pretty vulgar film too.
Yeah, and then there's the one guy that gets like, how 80s is it when he actually gets hit into a vat that says toxic waste on it and then he starts to melt?
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, I was like, that's actually a pretty good effect too, and I assume that's just all done practical makeup. And
well, when it came to like the vulgarity, when it came to the gore, when it came to some of the special effects and everything, to me, what translates is honestly, you have a bunch of filmmakers having so much fun.
Yeah.
They're like, it's basically like, okay, we have these 80s action movies. And what I'm getting from it is they're like, okay, that's kind of like the expectation that everyone has for a movie like this. But what if you did it like this?
Yeah.
And I was like, that is amazing. Because, how many times have you watched a movie and you're like, man, I think it's kind of like comic book movies. Everyone's like, man, how cool would it be if we got an R-rated comic book movie? And then you finally get like Deadpool.
Mm-hmm.
Like it takes somebody to go there and kind of, have fun in that way. And Deadpool is having fun in that way. I mean, the character in the comics is known for breaking the fourth wall and all that, talking directly to the audience. But it's almost like they're having so much fun that it's contagious. Like you can't help but watch all the death and destruction in Deadpool. And for some reason you're laughing. Mm-hmm. And it's like, I mean, it's brutal death. And I don't know, there's just something about Robocop, the original, where it feels like they're having fun and it's contagious.
No, absolutely. And, Paul Verhoeven talks a lot about kind of in the film and, this commentary on American society and our fascination with violence and the influence of the media, which are two things that you see throughout the film. And I think one of the way he drove that home is through, well, let's just make the goriest action movie we possibly can. And he also talks a lot about, for him, his kind of, in his words, he said, this is a film about an American Jesus. A man who dies and is resurrected to save us all. And he said the only way that American Jesus could die is he has to die a brutal death, and it has to be at the hand of a gun. So
interesting. Obviously, it has to be at the hand of a gun. That does speak volumes about America.
So that was his inspiration, and I think he delivered, because the execution of Murphy is probably one of the most visceral, violent, like movie scenes I can think of.
Well, and so that's where I think the remake actually loses some of this. In the remake, he dies at the hands of a car explosion.
Essentially a car bomb.
It loses a lot of that brutalness. And even to the end that when you watch the original and you follow through the entire story, RoboCop is uncovering his life throughout the movie. Now, granted, that's an expectation that the remake can't be afforded because most people that are going to see it have seen the original.
Mm-hmm.
And even though in the original, we all know that RoboCop is Murphy, like we know it from the beginning, but we're watching him kind of figure it out. In the new one, he actually knows it's him from the beginning, or he knows that it's himself. And so there's a little bit, obviously story-wise, the first one is kind of showing us how we lose our humanity, and we might have to regain that in order to actually kind of achieve our objectives. Don't lose your humanity. Don't become 100% robot.
Yeah.
And in the new one, it's weird because, like you said, one of the things they're doing is they're playing a little bit with like AI, and they're kind of they actually say, I think in the movie, they like dehumanize him or whatever, like make him lose more of his humanity, and they can kind of dial it up and dial it down. But it's just weird because it doesn't have the same impact. I mean, you think even the first movie ends with someone asking RoboCop, what is your name? And he says Murphy.
Yeah.
It's like he's reclaimed his humanity, and he was able to save the day. And I think, RoboCop in that movie is representative of like, hey, programs, laws, things like that, they're faceless. And the point is, try not to lose your humanity in that, and don't just because what is it? I think RoboCop has like 4 directives.
4 directives. Yeah.
Yeah. I can't name them, but maybe you can. Put you on the spot.
Wow.
But it's like uphold the law, don't kill anyone, and like serve the public.
Yeah,
or something. And then directive 4 is like you can't do anything against the corporation.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's interesting because those things, right? Those laws, it helps us understand that just because politicians get things passed, just because things happen, doesn't mean they're right. And we shouldn't lose our humanity and put all of our trust in these systems and things like that. And even though obviously the new one is, playing in that exact same sandbox as a remake, it just doesn't have anything new to add to it. And I'm like, in almost 20, years, no, 30 years, I think, since the original came out, I'm like, you don't have anything new to say.
Mm-hmm. No, it is interesting too, right? In the fact that in the remake, the 2014 version, the villains in the film it's kind of an issue of corrupt cops. It's kind of an issue of this faceless corporation, but the villains in the first one is actually Ed Jones taking advantage of people,
the corporation.
Right? And it's not even everyone at OCP is bad. It's mostly Dick Jones at OCP is bad, right?
Yeah.
But I think that the second one also kind of disregards a very important half of the conversation that the first one has, which is the police officers in the first one are very kind of torn by RoboCop. Like on one hand, he's there, he helps them. But then they are the ones tasked with putting him down. And some of them are like, hold on, like this doesn't work. Whereas that whole conversation about the actual role of men and women in law enforcement is removed from the second one. And essentially everyone is these Omnicorp thugs or the Omnicorp robots. And I think that's an important part of the conversation because RoboCop himself is half cop, half machine, right? We know the conversation regarding him and the machine, and we see it play out with the Ed robots, with OCP. But we need that other portion of his identity, which is his interaction with the police, which is kind of ignored in the second one, I think.
Agreed. And, the whole point, I guess, of making RoboCop, right? Using a person, right? Because why is RoboCop not just a Terminator?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? It could be. Mm-hmm. If you have all this technology and, you can do all these things, why wouldn't he just be a Terminator? And I think that's, at the end of the day, what the original one is getting at is that the reason for that is because if you're going to be a police officer and you're going to do these things, then you need to have humanity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's really what it's saying, is that, these things shouldn't be carried out by robots. They should be carried out by people who can make empathetic and sympathetic decisions based on whatever scenario they're in.
Exactly.
And
exactly.
That's why the first one, it's like, there's just so much going on that it's hard not to, have a fun conversation about what were they trying to say. And that's why I think Murphy's journey and RoboCop's journey is to rediscover his humanity and make sure that that's not lost in this whole experiment. Absolutely. And yeah, the new one, the thing is, it doesn't send the character on that same journey. Because I think at one point, doesn't he even ask almost to just be killed?
Yeah.
He says something. And I took it as like, he was like, just kill me.
Well, the second film, the person on the quest to rediscover RoboCop's humanity is his wife. It's not even Murphy.
That's what I'm saying. Like, it doesn't send RoboCop on that same thing. And more so with the wife, it's not even to rediscover his humanity. It's more to just rediscover his identity.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, who is this? And I know they know it's him because he goes and visits, but it's more so like they're just not playing with the same themes. It's more like she's just trying to figure something out than they are saying something grander.
Yeah.
So something else I wanted to ask you about was the music in both films.
Oh my gosh.
Going back to last week's episode of The Mummy, this also reminded me a little bit of that comparison, where I found the music to be very generic action movie music in the remake, where the original, although not an iconic theme, it felt like they had something there. Because RoboCop's not a theme that I think most people hum. It's not necessarily.
Unless you're me.
I think it's definitely, it's one of those themes where it's like, I think people might know it if they heard it, but most people wouldn't be able to just recall it. Yeah. The same way you can with like Jaws, dun, dun. It's very, everyone knows that. But at the same time, it works for the movie. And I think they're doing something with the music in the original where, again, the new one feels generic.
No, I agree. In fact, the only time they actually play the RoboCop theme is at the title credits. I was really disappointed they didn't play it any other time in the movie, including the ending, as the credits starts to roll. It just kind of does what any other action movie does. It's just a grab bag of music that fits the moment. The original one, Paul Verhoeven, I think is a genius, because when you watch it again, it's essentially the juxtaposition of two major musical pieces. There is the Murphy theme, which is the lighter classical one with the more string instruments. And there's the heavy brass and bass RoboCop theme, which is the mechanical one. And kind of the, Murphy's journey is in step with as we hear these two themes. And at the end, we hear more of the Murphy theme.
Right.
He has rediscovered his humanity. And I think it's just a conscious effort by the filmmaker to kind of play that out musically, what we're, as we're watching his journey unfold.
Yeah, you could feel it. They're using music to alter how we feel about what's happening on screen. And it's deliberate and you can sense it. And like I said, the other one just feels more generic. And so it's not that it is necessarily a detriment per se. I just don't think it's a huge positive there, the way it is in the original one. Now, I wanted to, finish up the conversation about the effects. I mean, to the end that, the new one does have, digital effects and all that. Would you give the nod to that, as kind of the only nod you would give to it? The effects are better.
The effects are better. I'll give it notes in the sense that I thought it was interesting in the fact that I thought it was interesting trying to incorporate Murphy's wife and son and see where that story went. I don't think it delivered as it could have, but I thought that was an interesting attempt. I thought it was
Yeah, because in the
interesting.
original one, right, his family left. They thought he was dead, right? And don't they get to that in the sequels later or something?
Yeah. I think, yeah. But in the first one, yeah, they're barely in it. They're in a couple flashback memories, and they mentioned that they moved away after he died.
Yeah.
The other thing that I thought was interesting is the scientists in the first one are very like scientisty. I thought it was interesting bringing in Gary Oldman's character to balance the ethical struggle of this man versus machine hybrid that he was building. But again, the filmmakers never truly committed to that version of the story and really flushing that out. And they never held true to the original RoboCop. So I think in both those story elements, while they were notable, interesting potential streets we could have driven down, nothing delivered. So I'm in agreement. I think the visual fight sequences are really the only part that is significantly better.
No, I did want to ask you, what do you think about like Sam Jackson's character? Is that the only story thread where they're trying to do something maybe a tad different?
I guess so. But even then, I mean, when you compare it to the original one, there's the I'd buy that for $1 guy popping up throughout, right? As kind of the talking to society part. And there are the newscasters. I think that is really just the attempt to kind of frame what's going on in the remake in a semblance of a story.
Interesting. Yeah. Again, I just didn't find it all. To me, I don't like it when movies are, you know, kind of at the end of the day, like everybody's kind of in on the conspiracy.
Yeah.
I don't know. That to me, when you get there, I'm like, I don't know. So the hero's kind of against like everybody. You're like, no one had some goodwill, and there is kind of the Gary Oldman character and like maybe, people playing around in this sandbox, but I don't know. It's just one of those things where I like you said, I just don't think they went far enough with those stories to really make it different. But so much time has passed since the original. It just felt like if you were going to do a modern day RoboCop, you should have something new to say about media, technology, this or that. Not just swapping out the technology and updating the media. You have to have something new to say about it.
No,
things have changed. We're in a different world. Like it shouldn't just be the same lesson from the original. If you're going to remake it, it should be more than that.
And I mean, they hinted it, but they never say it in the same way that there is a very clear message in the first one. I think the other thing that disappoints me about the remake, and this is a straight up remake, is the fact that there are very few of the appropriate nods to the original. I mean, granted, at the end of the movie, he ditches what I consider much more of a Batman suit and he gets back to their traditional RoboCop silver.
Yeah.
But even in that, I mean, the first one has so many iconic lines, your move, creep, did a lot. Like you watch this movie and you can't help but throw up a fist pump when he says them because they're just so 80s and like so RoboCop. And they don't really acknowledge any. I mean, they kind of throw some of them out as like really crappy fan service, but I would have appreciated more of a respectful nod to the original work. And I never felt that in this remake.
Yeah. And we do have to acknowledge, just like last week with The Mummy, there were planned sequels and additional RoboCop content that they wanted to make if this movie had been successful. And because of the movie we got, all of those things got canceled, just like The Mummy.
Yeah, I actually heard, I was reading something earlier that there may be another RoboCop film coming out, but I guess they're tying it now in as a almost direct sequel to the original franchise.
Huh, that's interesting.
So they've kind of moved off the remake overall and going back to that. There's also an interesting, just again going back to the role of the cultural impact of the first one. There's actually a documentary coming out which has been totally crowdfunded about the impact of the original RoboCop 30 years later.
Oh, I'll be watching that. Yeah.
I mean, how cool will that be?
So, and even earlier we were talking culturally, like, RoboCop got action figures. He got comic books. He was, RoboCop was in a lot of our cultural
lexicon.
zeitgeist, yeah, at the time, and even though that's faded over time, the original still has that, like I said, it's fun. It has that charm.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, it's funny because Paul Verhoeven, what are some of the other movies he's done? Because he has a certain kind of style.
Starship Troopers.
Yeah, that.
I mean, that's almost the exact same style visually, tonally. The themes are very similar to RoboCop.
RoboCop. Yeah, and for some reason those movies work, and I feel like when you remake them, you can't just take the things, right? I feel like this. I don't know why I always compare everything to Star Wars, but I feel like that's what Disney.
Dustin.
Yeah, that's what Disney was doing with Star Wars. Was they thought like, oh, you know what we can do is we can purchase for $4 billion. We can make a movie where we can put X-wings in the Millennium Falcon. But to the fans, we're like, you don't understand what makes Star Wars Star Wars.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just the things that we dress up in our story or the costumes we wear to the premiere, although those are the iconic things that we love. It's like they don't understand something about what originally was. It feels like with Paul Verhoeven movies, there's something there that's really
mm-hmm.
unique, but it's not the things that the movie gets dressed up in.
Mm-hmm.
It's
mm-hmm.
what he has to say about something about our culture, about, and that's what really stands the test of time, and why I think you can still watch RoboCop today, despite some of its, poor graphics and maybe 80s cheesiness and all that, and still really love it.
Yeah.
And same thing with Starship Troopers. I don't know if they've remade Starship Troopers, but I mean, I know they made a sequel and it was not good.
Well, maybe we'll have to talk about that in a couple of weeks.
Yeah. So anyway, I guess my verdict is, of course, the original RoboCop is superior to the remake. And, even though I'm not going to lie, unlike The Mummy, I actually did have fun watching the remake of RoboCop. I didn't hate it. And it's not a movie that I would say is necessarily a bad movie. It's just that if you have to compare the two, I don't think it's much of a comparison. But this one I actually had fun watching.
Well, yeah, and I'll kind of jump in there. I'm 100% in agreement. Obviously, the original is the best. The original is so, memorable and imaginable, and it just has just this fun quality. The second one plays out more like an action film today. It's a little more generic. I think that had it not been under the RoboCop mantle,
okay,
it probably would have held up better, and people probably would have been like, oh yeah, this is an awesome action movie. Like, it was a lot of fun.
Yeah. Okay. That's actually a really good way to put it. Cause it's like, yeah, I mean, if obviously because it's a direct remake, I mean, you can't help but compare the two,
mm-hmm.
And yeah, if you were to remove that, I actually did enjoy the movie.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not even, I'm not here to hate on it to the degree that I'm saying like I didn't have fun, and I don't think it was, a bad movie.
Watchable or anything.
Yeah. I would go, if we went to last week's conversation about The Mummy, I didn't really care for the Mummy remake. I wasn't feeling it.
Mm-hmm.
This one I actually enjoyed. So yeah, I think it fades under that comparison, but wasn't the worst. So to that end, I would say that if you are interested in RoboCop at all, I would say go check out the original, but I'd also recommend checking out the remake, where last week I would have been like, don't even bother. Just watch the, 1999 version and get on with your life.
Question to you, and
Sure.
Audience, chime in on this as well when, you're sharing your thoughts. Do you think one of the detriments to the 2014 RoboCop was the fact that it was made as a PG-13 movie as opposed to an R movie like the original?
Oh, definitely. I think the R rating of the original was something that helped it stand out from comparable action movies of the time. And even, if you watch that movie, I'm telling you, man, even the vulgarity, the gore, the stuff, I mean, compared to other movies we've seen since then, I mean, it's still got to be one of the top movies where you're getting all of those things. It's really relishing in its R rating and pushing it as far as it can go. Because it's weird, because sometimes movies get an R rating because they said, like, the F word one too many times.
Yeah.
This movie's like, no, if we're going to get an R rating, then we're going to say it.
We're just going to own it.
Yeah. You know, if they're going to say it's going to be R rated, then we're going to blow people's body parts off. You know,
yeah.
This is not just us, you know, unfortunately not getting the rating we want. They're like, we're going to lean into it and have fun. And yeah, I think the remake definitely doesn't benefit because it feels more generic.
Yeah.
You know, like what movie have you seen, like an action movie that's like the original Robocop with those elements, the rated R elements? Imagine if we got like a, you know, 2014 fully rated R Robocop of its time. It would have been dope.
Yeah, no, you're right.
If only for that, you know, I guess kind of, you know, it could have been Deadpool before Deadpool.
Mm-hmm. True. That's a good point.
And they just didn't lean into it. They didn't go do that. And I think it could have been, yeah, Deadpool before Deadpool is perfect, I think, way to say it.
Perfect way to say it.
Yeah. And it's such a bummer because the original one has fun in that sandbox. And this one seems to be actively avoiding it. I assume because they thought they could reach a larger audience. I don't know.
One of those things I will never understand about studio execs.
Yeah, I'm like, I think they should have owned it and just went all in. And I do think the other thing they should have done is just worked a little bit harder at having something new to say about our culture and the time we were in, so that an updated version feels like it's needed, not this, you know, kind of like nostalgia throwback. And hey, we just wanted to remake it, right? You said at the top of the podcast, to make money. It would have been great to be like, wow, I mean, this movie has something really to say. And you know what, if you're more interested in, you know, what's going on in our culture today, I would recommend watching the remake because it much more speaks to our time. And it doesn't. And that's where it hurts, because they had such an opportunity. I would have loved to seen it.
Yeah, I agree. Would have been interesting. Well, that's our verdict. Tell us what you think. If you saw the original, if you saw the remake, and if you haven't seen the original, then why are you listening to this podcast? Like, go rent it on Vudu. Buy it on Vudu. Buy it, because you're going to watch it multiple times. Just buy it now.
The rewatchable quality on Robocop is high. It's great.
Yep. At NDCal5, at Big Kid D-Man.
Yeah, be sure to follow the podcast at Film Comp Podcast, and you can find us on all the major social media and social media networks and everything. You can Google the podcast, Filmmakers Compass Podcast. You can find our website where we have all of our links to wherever the podcast can be found. And we want to thank everybody for tuning in. We really appreciate you guys listening to the show. Hope you enjoyed the episode, and be sure to continue the conversations. Help us get more engagement on social media so we can get a bigger footprint and bring in more people to listen to the show. But thank you so much. Hope you enjoyed the show.
Absolutely. Next week, we're going to be watching the original Space Jam and comparing it to the brand new one coming out.
This is a whole new thing for movie remake time. Think about it. We got a movie coming to theaters, a new movie coming out, a new remake. So I'm really pumped because it's taken the podcast up to a whole new level. And I hope people definitely tune in, because I know a lot of people are going to check out Space Jam. There's, the original one, as cheesy as it is, meant a lot to a lot of people.
Absolutely. So I'm looking forward to the conversation. We hope you'll check in. Until then, keep watching movies, and we'll see you next time.